What occurs if a stolen name is used into a weapon? Can shouts be heard over silence? To what extent would a mother go when the world doesn't even allow her to mourn? This is not merely a tale of slavery. It's about a woman who used obedience as a weapon and silent retaliation. She was Cora, and one thread at a time, she wreaked her revenge. The fields were hot, heavy, and stretched out with silence as they breathed in the dusk like a dying beast. The air was inflated by a storm that would not arrive, and the cotton was hanging limp. A woman who no one dared to closely observe strolled among the rows. Cora was her name, and she was clearly listed in the Whitmore Plantation's ledger. 24 house-trained, no records of defiance, but ink doesn't reveal anything about fire. It had been weeks since they took Samuel that Cora had spoken out loud. He had been born under a ripped blanket and the fractured gaze of a wooden beam in the corner of the old smokehouse. No between contractions, the midwife said. Doctor, no prayers, just the bet. For your own sake, daughter, don't let him talk. And Cora had Samuel, who never once shed a tear. Silence had been his language since birth. A month prior to the boy's birth, Samuel's father, Elijah, had been laid to rest in an unmarked cemetery. They said that by remaining still during the colonel's passing, he was encouraging disobedience and was whipped to death. He had spent too much time staring at the horizon. According to the overseer, it was risky for a slave to appear to be dreaming. When Samuel was born, he had those identical eyes. 2 days later, Clarissa Whitmore saw him. The smell of cold steel and lavender followed her as she entered the quarters without warning. Pale and precise, her gaze landed on the baby in the fading linen. She remained motionless for too long. The next night, Samuel was no longer in the quarters. Then, in an overly casual tone, she replied, "This one could pass." He was given the name Thomas by Clarissa. She positioned him next to the lace curtains that were brought in from Charleston in a white crib in the nursery. He had a blanket with his monogram over his legs and a silver rattle next to him. Cora was called in to clean the carpeting where the colonel's hunting dog had soiled itself, not to nurse her son. Cora did as she was told. The stillness altered, but she always did what she was told. She sat awake in the corner of her room at night, clutching and unclenching the edge of her apron with her fingers. She had gone insane, the other women muttered. However, Cora always walked with poise, composure, and purpose every morning. Clarissa was given tea by her. The banisters were polished by her. She kept her eyes firmly on the floor as she passed the nursery. Radiant with this new, miraculous child, Clarissa told a tale of divine blessing and long-awaited motherhood as she paraded Thomas in front of the guests. The colonel remained silent. He continued to drink. Thomas left the room when he started, crying. Months passed after a few weeks. Cora's quiet developed roots. She buried the remains of her son's birth in a hole she dug under her room's floorboards. Elijah had once concealed a carved symbol in her apron pocket, along with a strand of his hair and a sample of the fabric he had originally been wrapped in. Without a ceremony, she buried them, putting her palm to the ground as though making a vow. Not even the moon could see her cry. By the time Thomas walked over the house's shiny floor for the first time, Cora had vanished into thin air, breathing softly like another piece of furniture, behind closed doors. Occasionally, Clarissa would catch her staring too intently at the lad and dismiss her with a smug flick of the wrist. "Return to your home, Cora. The firewood will not come to it on its own." Cora never answered. The boy did not glance at Clarissa when he said his first word, Mama, though. The woman with the platter of lemons in the entryway caught his attention. Her eyes were quiet and black. Cora started whispering once more after that day, although not in front of people or in the light of day. However, some claimed to have heard her voice, low and measured, repeating a single name, one that was buried lower than cotton roots and not mentioned in any records, when the wind rose at night, curling through the fields and beneath the windowsills. Her name was Samuel. Thomas Whitmore was able to read scripture with the clarity of a preacher's kid by the time he was 5 years old. He sipped milk from French-imported porcelain cups, played the family piano on scales, and wore ironed cotton clothes. When he entered a room, the home staff was taught to bow. Clarissa referred to him as my little gentleman and used her ivory fan to gently tap him to straighten his posture. He was not referred to as Samuel. From the house's shadows, Cora observed his metamorphosis. She cleaned the porcelain he drank from, laundered the sheets he soiled while he slept, and polished the floors he walked on. She was familiar with the pattern of his coughing during the cold months, the sound of his footsteps, and the tone of his laughter. However, she never once touched him. Clarissa's insistence on distance had become law, supported by her stern look and the quiet. Clarissa asserted that the boy's fair skin was a gift from God and that he had been sent to her by divine decree. His golden tone, she told guests, was evidence that her prayers had been heard. She knew how near the truth was beneath the surface, but she never spoke it out loud. It just flickered behind her eyes when she looked at Cora. Clarissa called Cora into her room one night. The embroidered walls were covered in long shadows from the low-burning oil lamp. Standing by her vanity, Clarissa brushed her hair in, methodical, steady strokes. Without turning around, she added, "I want you to stop looking at him. You look at it too long. The boy can feel it." Cora remained silent. With a tight voice, Clarissa went on, "Cora, you have a place, and it's not next to him. I'll send you back to the fields if I catch your gaze lingering once more." No response was required. Cora walked silently out of the room. That, with a handful of dirt in her fingers and the word Samuel on her lips, she sat beneath the cypress tree near the quarters at night and whispered to the roots. Thomas forgot the woman who had originally held him as the years went by. His environment became one of marble and lace, of etiquette and hymnals. He studied the art of gentle indifference, repeated French greetings, and committed psalms to memory. Clarissa made sure his future was predestined, and his history was pure. Cora, however, recalled everything. She started making a quilt. Inenery, secret, mending bloodied handkerchiefs, fading aprons, pieces of ancient slave shirts, and remnants of discarded fabric. Every square displayed a symbol that was selected from memory. A closed eye, a twisted tree, a bird in flight. She embroidered a single name in the center, but it was too dark to be seen at first glance. Thomas wasn't the one. Cora's silent unraveling was spoken about by the other women. How she carried a torch down the hallways at night, stopping by the nursery door and singing softly lullabies to no specific person. How she never disobeyed orders, never raised her voice, and never made demands, even though the overseer once discovered her staring into the hearth, with her lips moving in prayer or curse, as though something invisible had started to change. Clarissa could feel the strain in her own house's walls. The youngster had become reticent, prone to extended looks at things that no one else seemed to notice, and abrupt silences. She responded to his question about his origins with a giggle that was too acerbic to be maternal. "I prayed for you," she said. "All you need to know is that. However, youngsters have an ear for truth from birth." Thomas got out of bed that night and went to the hallway barefoot. He listened for several minutes while standing there. Cora sat in her kitchen corner down the hallway, humming something ancient and low while her needle danced in and out of the fabric. Observing her from the shadows, he refrained from approaching. Without raising her gaze, Cora repeated the forgotten name in a whisper. Samuel, there was no thunder when the drought struck. Under the weight of an unforgiving sun, the fields burned to ash, the soil split, and the air grew thicker. Days flowed into one another in silence, interrupted only by the dull metallic groan of the plantation's old well and the clatter of empty buckets. Clarissa Whitmore stood there one evening, a glass of cherry shaking between her fingers. The hem of her dress dragged in the dust, her cheeks flushed with wine and annoyance, next to the stone rim that was half sucked up by creeping moss. She said the staff was becoming sluggish because of the heat. Twice that week, she had threatened to send the younger ones south to the block of auctions. Cora had been called in to deliver buckets. She took slow, deliberate steps toward the well, her shoulders straightened against the phantom blow that always lingered close by, her eyes focused on the pail in her hands. At first, Clarissa did not acknowledge her, wavering slightly. She seemed to be listening as she gazed into the well's black mouth. Then she said something. "Thomas is being sent away by me." Cora stopped and slowly lowered the pail to the floor. The edges of Clarissa's voice were pinched and fragile. "Massachusetts is home to a boarding school in New England. Boys are taught to become men, gentle, well-spoken, and unaffected. Like smoke, the word hung in the air." Cora didn't answer. The edges of Clarissa's mouth quirked between sluggishness and apprehension as she turned to face her. "He's too perceptive and soft. I've also observed his gaze on you. It must end." A rush of steaming heat moved between them, raising Cora's apron's edge. She remained motionless, her hands by her sides, her face composed. But her gaze was focused on something far more distant than Clarissa or the well. The silence was misinterpreted by Clarissa as acquiescence. Her heels echoed in the dust as she drained the last of her sherry and headed back toward the house. Cora didn't go back to the quarters after dinner that evening. She hovered in the shade of the kitchen wall, close to the back of the house. She remained there until everyone in the house went to sleep. She noiselessly slipped inside. She walked confidently in the gloom in the Colonel's private study upstairs. She took out a dusty black leather book from the bottom drawer of the writing desk, the one Clarissa had never opened. The ledger of the plantation included our purchase dates, deceased people's names, and records of children born without surnames. Only once did her fingers shake. She flipped to the October 12, 1857 page, the day Samuel was born. Beside it, a note with the words, "Child taken to house, renamed, claimed," was in the rigid hand of the Colonel. She shut the book, tucked it under her apron, and vanished down the corridor. Cora moved more purposefully in the weeks that followed. Resuming her nightly chores, she trimmed the candle wicks, cleaned the study, and polished the piano. Nobody questioned it. She was protected by her quiet. Clarissa sensed something, but her obedience was expected. Little things started to catch her attention. Left drawers. A little jar. The child asked sharper questions. He remained silent for longer. She once saw him reading in the garden while gripping a page too hard, seemingly worried that it would go. Then came the letter, a solitary envelope left open under the Colonel's pile of letters, addressed to an abolitionist Boston pastor, written in a hand that resembled one of the tutors. Names, dates, and one line in particular were included. "Here, a boy who was nurtured in a lie-filled environment and robbed of his blood survives. Thomas is not his name." It wasn't. The smell of smoke permeated Clarissa's room for days after she burned the letter before dawn. But Cora remained silent. She only knelt beside the quilt beneath her bed at night, when everyone else had fallen asleep, and embroidered in silence. A needle, a thread, a name. Samuel, over and over. The land has started to feel the fever of the conflict, smoke on the edge of the sky, distant thunder that wasn't thunder. With a Bible in one hand and a revolver in the other, the Colonel rode out one morning in full dress, shining and stiff-backed, to join the Confederacy. The house he left behind smelled of rusted magnolia and was filled with quiet. Clarissa took over. She now received reports from the overseers. With a harsh voice, she gave directions while walking the veranda with a ledger tightly gripped. The change sent shivers down the spines of the slaves. The colonel's infrequent and erratic mercy had no longer softened her brutality. She spoke, sharper, hit harder, and punished abruptly. Under her, Cora moved like a shadow, still silent and submissive. However, the house's order had started to deteriorate. The boy was the first. Thomas Samuel was becoming comfortable with his own. Quiet. He was no longer quick to answer calls. From the window upstairs, he observed the fields. Clarissa once discovered him with ash on his hands and tears on his cheeks, gazing at the cook fire. She hit him. He did not recoil. Cora had witnessed it. From within, not from the entryway. She was back at the table serving. Maybe as a test, maybe for convenience, Clarissa had let it happen. But every night when she set the food in front of the boy, her hand lingered long enough for her fingers to touch his back. It's always the same. A signal, a beat, 1, 2, 3. His eyes followed her as he started to reply quietly, a nod, a delay before talking, the gradual unraveling of a secret. Thomas discovered a bundle wrapped in oilcloth one afternoon while investigating the rear of the storage room next to the servants' staircase. There were squares of tattered fabric embroidered with odd shapes and symbols he didn't understand inside a faded patchwork quilt. A word, almost imperceptible to the naked eye, is stitched in the center. He ran his finger over it. Samuel. He folded it carefully under his mattress and carried it to his bed. He didn't sleep that night. He went up to Cora by the water, basin behind the home the following morning. When he arrived, she didn't turn. What does it signify? It is what was stolen, Cora replied, and what cannot be unmade. Her hands continued to move as she gently wrung the laundry, water trickling from her wrists. When Thomas went to the study that evening and opened the drawer that Clarissa had never opened, he discovered he flipped through the Plantation ledger, pausing on October 12, 1857, when he saw the name, the correction, and the theft written in ink. He didn't make a sound. Clarissa, who was annoyed by the boy's distance, had started making plans for his departure, arranging for a boarding school in Massachusetts that was sympathetic to Southern bloodlines. She intended to send him before winter, but something in her had. She did not understand why the house felt colder now, even with the heat pressing against the windows, and she started to tremble. She found herself locking her chamber door at night, checking her jewelry twice, and whispering prayers in the dark. Then came the second letter, which was mailed from a nearby town, posted under a false name, and addressed once more to a northern contact. It contained a more thorough account, testimonies, and records, and the page from the ledger was meticulously copied in Cora's exact hand. No supplication, no cry for help, just the truth honed like a blade and slipped under. The door of history. A Union scouting party came through the area a few days later. There was no gunfire, no banners, just a knock at the door and a list of names. Clarissa accepted them graciously and pretended to be perplexed. But as the men strolled around the grounds, examining buildings and having hushed conversations with the enslaved, she felt something tear at her bones. Cora stood by the well, observing. That evening, she took the quilt out of its. Her hands moved quickly, threading the last letter. Not S, not T, but a red line, a wound across the fabric, a mark that did not belong to any alphabet. And then she folded it, pressed it to her chest, and closed her eyes. The war broke out in the South with a whimper. Gunpowder turned to rust, flags were lowered, and men came home with hollow eyes and limbs that no longer belonged to any alphabet. They came suddenly, blue coats, papers in hand, northern voices, shaped by colder winds, and Clarissa was in the parlor, drinking tea from a cracked cup when they arrived. Her hands trembled, but she covered it up with a smile too bright, too thin. The Whitmore plantation stood unaffected by fire, but changed nonetheless. The cotton fields grew wild now, unpicked, waving like ghost hands beneath the weight of silence. Cora spoke softly, if at all, and offered no more than was necessary, but her eyes met theirs, and in that gaze lay a gravity that shifted something unsaid. In one of the officer's bags, there was a folded letter, anonymous, precise, familiar, handwriting stitched into words like thread into flesh. Clarissa's mask cracked when they asked about the boy, about Thomas or Samuel or whatever name they were asking. Surely no threat to your noble cause. The boy himself didn't say much. He stood in the hallway, not quite hiding, not quite watching, but when the men left, he went straight to the garden, to the old cypress, where the ground had been disturbed years before, and he waited there. Cora joined him. In her hands, the quilt unfolded now, its final square revealed, not in letters, but in the words, "You were never theirs," were sewn in Cora's own hand beneath a pattern of blood-coated thread that resembled a broken chain. Samuel accepted it silently. Something happened between them in that instant. Not a reunion, not a revelation, but a recognition. That night, Clarissa packed 2 trunks and tried to escape, but the wagon broke down before she could reach the crossroads. And the driver, a hired man with no remaining loyalty, left her behind. She went back to the house barefoot. "You think this changes anything?" Clarissa spat, voice. "You think the world will care what he is?" Cora's silence was more conclusive than any word. She stepped aside, granting passage, not as a servant, but as a witness. She found Cora in the hallway, waiting. For the first time in years, they stood face to face with nothing between them. No child, no command, no pretense. Clarissa left the following morning, but no one noticed. For weeks, the house was silent, as if it were grieving for something it couldn't identify. Then one morning, Cora disappeared. There was no goodbye or note, just the quilt, folded neatly, at Samuel's bed. Years went by, and the boy who had been given other names shed them like old skin. He went north and learned letters once more, this time on his... He never called himself Thomas again, and when asked about his mother, he would pause as if tasting the word for the first time, saying, "She was never mine." He began teaching on, his own terms, not of math or scripture, but of silence, of stealing, of stories buried beneath cypress trees and stone wells.